emergency. was at our convocation.
Cool.
Who else has come? Eddie Moore. He was the third private individual to go to the International Space Station.
It's called Omar, and it's the foreign language entry from Palestine. So yeah, it's kind of fun.
That's cool. Well, I'll let you get ready. I'm
Okay.
gonna go out to the other side.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you.
Should I go do shadow puppets or something?
No,
Yeah.
I was just laughing at that. How long is your presentation?
I can make it as short or as long as anybody needs me. They told me 55 minutes, which I guess means, what, 10, 20? 10, 15?
What time is the gig started?
Supposed to start at 9:20, but
That's not happening.
yeah.
So if we get started at 9:30, it's 10:20.
Okay. I mean, don't they have another class, or what time do these students have to be in the next thing?
Yeah, we changed the schedule around, so we made the summit schedule to I think 10:15.
All right. So I'll try to get off the stage by 10:15.
Because you're gonna do some signings over there, some sales.
Yeah.
And stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And there's a clock out there, right? I think there's a clock out there, right? I think I saw one on the right. Okay. Okay.
Piece of information. Feel free to toggle your volume if you want more sound on the video.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So I should be off the stage at 10:15. Ish.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance Welcome to this very special day at Hun School of Princeton. Not only are we joined here by our students and our faculty from the upper and middle schools, we're also joined by about 160 visitors from outside, friends of the school, trustees, alumni, parents. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Online, we are webcasting, and I know that our former headmaster, Jim Beyer, who's a giant in the history of the school, is watching someplace, so greetings to Jim Beyer online. And the reason for this gathering today, as you know, is a very interesting and important speaker. This is our birthday at the Hun School of Princeton. It's our 100th anniversary. We're celebrating our centennial in a variety of really fun ways. One of those ways is a Centennial Speakers Series. We thought, what better way to celebrate 100 years at an educational institution than to bring in thought leaders from various fields, journalism, politics, the arts, entrepreneurs, to come in and talk with students about not the past 100 years, but what they can expect in the next 100 years. This is one of those Centennial speakers today. The topic for today is unity in diversity. Unity in diversity. There probably isn't a much more important topic in the world today as the world shrinks, but we continue to have these troubling divisions. And our guest today has spent most of his life thinking about those issues of religion, religious differences, international differences. He's a scholar. He has a degree in theological studies from Harvard. He has a degree in creative writing from the University of Iowa, and he has a doctorate in sociology specializing in religion from the University of California. He is an author of best-selling books, a book called No God But God about Islam's history and future, a book called Zealot, which is the history and mission of Jesus. He's the author of any number of articles in popular and scholarly magazines. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and one of probably the country's foremost experts and speakers on religion and foreign relations. He's also appeared, as you know, many of you, on TV shows like The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, Fox News, many other national broadcasts. He has a very interesting set of thoughts to share with us today on this topic of unity and diversity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Reza Aslan.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Am I doing all right? Okay, all right. It's such a pleasure to be here on this bright, crisp morning. I just flew in from Los Angeles where it was 70 degrees. Eat your heart out. No, it really is a great pleasure to be here, especially to celebrate the birthday of this great school, Hun. I want to thank all the faculty and the staff and the parents for coming out. I especially want to thank the students for coming out here. Not that you had a choice in the matter, but I suppose you could have hidden in the bathroom during this talk, but I appreciate you not doing that and coming out here and listening to me, because obviously I'm here mostly to talk to you guys, and then occasionally I'll look down at the parents and the staff. It really is a great pleasure to be here. It's funny, I speak to a lot of high schools and really sort of great academic institutions, and every time I walk into an amazing campus like Hun's, I can't help but think about how much I hate you guys. I hate you so much. Because I went to the worst high school. I mean, the crappiest high school that you can imagine. The kind of high school where like you have to walk through metal detectors in order to get to class. The kind of high school where you couldn't wear anything that was red or blue because you might be in a gang. That kind of high school. Now, the kind of high school that you would see like on an episode of 21 Jump Street, which is apparently a movie now too. The movie's not as good as the TV show. Ask your parents about the TV show. It's like, the kind of school where you had these undercover cops, although they didn't look like, Channing Tatum. They looked more like your dad, actually. Like 300 pounds and had a mustache, pretending to be a high schooler. You want to buy some drugs? That kind of high school. And so I never had this kind of amazing, high school opportunity that you guys have had. And I really, really hate you for it. That said, it is great to be here. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in Iran. My family left Iran in 1979. There was this big revolution in Iran, and many Iranians sort of fled the kind of post-revolutionary chaos. Came to the United States in 1979, 1980. I don't know, obviously a lot of you were born long after the 80s, but some of you older folks, you remember the 80s. Not exactly the best time to be Iranian in the United States. This was, of course, at the height of the Iran hostage crisis. 444 days in which Americans were being held hostage in Iran. It was pretty uncomfortable to be in a 7-year-old Iranian kid in the United States in the midst of this, as opposed to now when being Iranian is awesome. But back then it was kind of tough. A lot of anti-Iranian sentiment, especially for a 7-year-old kid who barely speaks English. I learned English mostly by watching Sesame Street. And by the way, it was only much, much later that I realized that 8 years old is not an appropriate age to watch Sesame Street. Like that, I just assumed that that's like the average age of the Sesame Street watcher. But then when I was walking around elementary school, like as an 8 or 9-year-old, talking about how today's letter is brought to you by the letter of C, that was totally inappropriate. But this was a time in which there was an enormous amount of anti-Iranian sentiment in the United States, and anti-Muslim sentiment in general. There was a real sense that somehow Iranians were kind of a fifth column in society, even though there were so few of us around. But all eyes, all focus was on what was taking place in the country of my birth. And so for me, I did everything in my power to sort of distance myself from my culture, my heritage, to separate myself certainly from my religion. In the early 80s, being Muslim was like being a Martian in the United States. I even, for a while, pretended to be Mexican. I thought that would help. I kind of look a little bit Mexican. I learned how to break dance, feathered my hair. I passed for a good couple of years. But the truth of the matter is that during that time, and certainly growing up and going to high school, there was never a moment in which I actually felt as though I was not American. There was never a moment in which I felt as though my very identity was under attack. This, by the way, was true even after the attacks of September 11th. I think there's this image about that time which has sort of been lost to us in our memories, that as a result of those attacks, there was this sort of great wave of anti-Muslim or anti-Middle Eastern sentiment in this country. But actually, that's not exactly true. That's not really what happened. On the contrary, actually, what we saw in the aftermath of that tragedy was the country really coming together, uniting behind its Muslim population. And indeed, even as I was traveling back and forth between D.C. and New York and speaking to political and religious leaders, I would hear the same sentiment over and over again, that the best weapon that we have in this ideological conflict with Al-Qaeda is our own American Muslim community, that far from them being the enemy, that they are actually should be at the front lines of this conflict. And you see, I think part of that has to do with something that's uniquely American, and that is this sort of sense of American identity. You see, a country of immigrants can't define itself, can't define its collective identity based on a common ethnicity or a common religion or a common culture or a common race or even a common language for that matter. Like I said, I live in Los Angeles and we do not all speak English by any means. Instead, a country of immigrants has to define itself by something a little bit more nebulous. It defines its identity, its collective identity, based more on a shared agreement about a set of values, a set of principles, things that bind us together in all of our diversity. It's a miracle that in 250 years of this nation's existence, that this sense of identity that, again, is predicated on just a shared agreement about the things, the values that we hold in common, the principles that we hold in common, has actually managed to maintain this strong sense of what it means to be American. There's really no reason for it to have worked this long, but it has. And yet, the problem is, of course, that in times of societal distress, that sense of unity starts to be tested. And we certainly saw this in large ways after September 11th. But the truth is that it wasn't really until around 2004, 2005, 2006 that the rhetoric about America's Middle Eastern and Muslim community started to change. As I said, during those first few years after September 11th, when you listen to our politicians and our religious leaders, our political leaders, the conversation, the dialogue, the rhetoric was all about unity, all about coming together. Yes, of course, there were people on the fringes, the sort of radical Islamophobes and the xenophobes, and they're always there and they will always be there, but it wasn't part of the mainstream conversation. And then, sometime around 2005, 2006, something started to change. The rhetoric started to change. And I suppose like the best example of this that I can give is something that happened right around 2006, 2007, around there. And I just want to remind you of this in case you've forgotten.
On September 11th, they declared war against us. And to celebrate that murder of 3,000 Americans, they want to build a monstrous 13-story mosque at Ground Zero. This ground is sacred. Where we weep, they rejoice. That mosque is a monument to their victory and an invitation for more. A mosque at Ground Zero must not stand. The political class says nothing. The politicians are doing nothing to stop it. But we Americans will be heard. Join the fight to kill the Ground Zero Mosque. Go to GOPtrust.com. Paid for by National Republican Trust PAC, which is responsible for the content of this message.
Oh yes, the Ground Zero Mosque. You remember that thing that was neither a mosque nor at Ground Zero? By the way, I should mention that the GOP Trust is not an official organization of the Republican Party. It's an independent fundraising arm that raises funds for Republican candidates, but it doesn't have anything to do with the actual GOP. It's not so much the issue of the Park 51 Center, you know, the multicultural, multi-faith art center that's built blocks away from Ground Zero, that I want to focus on here. What I want to focus on is the wording that was used in that very popular and widely disseminated commercial. Did you catch the beginning of it? On September 11th, they murdered 3,000 of our fellow citizens. They attacked us. And now they want to build a mosque at Ground Zero. Did you catch that? This bald-faced attempt to actually link al-Qaeda terrorists with America's Muslim community had never been done in this kind of mainstream fashion before. This was completely new. The idea that the people who were actually responsible for September 11th, the people who killed 3,000 Americans on that day, are American Muslims. That's exactly what this commercial is saying. Was something that you would never, ever hear in this kind of mainstream rhetoric about Muslims in the US, and yet this became sort of a turning point in which the very language, the way that we defined Muslims and Middle Easterners in the US began to shift. And by the way, you saw it in the numbers. There was a huge and unprecedented uptick in the anti-Muslim sentiment of Americans from the immediate aftermath of September 11th, in which 43% of Americans said that they harbor anti-Muslim sentiments, to about almost 60% in 2010. You had, of course, a huge number of Americans, nearly 2/3 of them, who believe that Muslims now should not be given the same First Amendment rights as other Americans, other communities in the United States. Of course, you had nearly half of Americans talking about how American and Islamic values are inherently in conflict with each other. 1/3 of Americans now, that's 100 million of us, 1/3 of Americans believe that Muslims should be forced to carry special IDs designating them as Muslims. And you students of history, I'll let you rack your brain to try to figure out some kind of historical analogy to this, because I can't seem to think of one right now. And of course, we saw this in the incidents, the sudden spike of incidents in anti-Muslim violence. The numbers for the FBI statistics speak for themselves. This sort of steady uptick that we saw in violence against Muslims. And in 2012, you had in an 11-day period, 8 mosques in the United States being attacked, vandalized, burned down in an 11-day period. 8 mosques in this country, which is hard to even imagine. I mean, if you want to try to figure out how hard it is to imagine, replace the word mosque with anything else. Replace the word mosque with church or synagogue, and try to imagine what that would mean for this country if in 11 days, 8 synagogues around this country were burned to the ground or vandalized. We saw an uptick in the number of harassments against Muslims and Muslim communities across the country. Incidents of vandalism, many of them very close to this area, actually. Mosques, Islamic centers, Islamic schools being vandalized and attacked. And of course, horrific accounts of arsons, Islamic centers, mosques, houses of worship being burned to the ground. This became a part of the general fear of Muslims that all of a sudden gripped Americans. Again, not in the aftermath of 2011, indeed 2001, and not even connected to those attacks. This was something new, something unprecedented, something unexpected, this sudden jump around 2006, 2007 or so in anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Muslim violence in this country. It turns out that an organization called the Center for American Progress did a 2-year study about what this is about. How did this come about? And what they discovered shouldn't come as a surprise to a lot of us. What they discovered is that this spike in anti-Muslim sentiment was engineered, was actually the result of a very well-organized, very well-funded cabal of individuals and organizations who'd been funded to the tune of nearly $40-something million in order to spread this conception, this notion that somehow Muslims, American Muslims, are an internal enemy. Now, this is a very standard process that takes place, and as I will talk about in a moment, that has taken place throughout American history. But let me just talk you very quickly through how this sort of echo chamber works. It begins with what we call misinformation experts. These are these sort of pseudo experts, these internet crusaders many of whom have been listed under a whole host of anti-racist and bigotry groups. For instance, Robert Spencer is a very good example of this. Robert Spencer runs an organization called Jihad Watch. He's been listed by both the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center as the leader of an officially designated hate group. Robert Spencer, of course, is the same guy who also said that the decision by Campbell's Soup to issue a line of halal soups is the first step in the Muslim takeover of America. So obviously he's a moron. Yeah, because that's our secret plan. Soup. One soup at a time, and then we're taking over. You had people like Daniel Pipes issuing these sort of pseudo-academic papers, warning about the sort of Muslim takeover of the United States. People like Frank Gaffney, Brigitte Gabriel, most famously perhaps Pamela Geller. Pamela Geller runs an organization called Stop the Islamization of America, another organization that both the Southern Poverty Law Center and the ADL has designated as a hate group. In fact, they recently were denied their trademark application by the US government precisely because their only reason for existence is as a hate group. Pamela Geller, by the way, funny story, she's also the one who, after the election of Barack Obama, said that Obama was the bastard love child of Malcolm X. Look it up. I'm not kidding. Now, you look at these characters and you think, well, these are obviously like idiots, right? I mean, these are people on the far fringes. Nobody would take this kind of stuff seriously, although $40 million behind you tends to make your voice just a little bit louder. But the way that this works, the way this echo chamber works becomes very important. You have the misinformation experts, and they begin to start feeding this material, their sort of pseudo-scientific, pseudo-scholarly works, warning Americans about the impending Muslim takeover of America. And they now have sort of a very nice echo chamber for that to go into. You know a lot of these people. They all happen to come from one particular news program, news network. But, people like Sean Hannity, like Rush Limbaugh, who begin to take these talking points and start sort of vomiting them out over and over again. People from the pulpit, pastors like John Hagee, people like Franklin Graham, who begin to spread this message not through the airways but through the pulpit instead. And then, once this message starts to get out into the ether, it gets picked up by the political pundits, right? It becomes political talking points, so that you have people like Newt Gingrich. By the way, if anyone can figure out what this actually means, what in the world is Newt Gingrich talking about? This is the man who is called the intellect of the far right. Seriously. Newt Gingrich, by the way, was also the guy who very famously, during the presidential elections, when he was running for president, vowed that among his first acts at becoming president is to pass a constitutional amendment banning Sharia or Islamic law in the United States. Yeah, that was going to be his first act as president. No one bothered to tell Newt Gingrich that we actually already have a constitutional amendment banning Islamic law. It's called the Constitution. I think Newt Gingrich needs to go back to high school. But Newt Gingrich, Representative Allen West, you heard these people using the sort of the political bullhorns that they had to begin to espouse the same kind of rhetoric that we used to see only in the far fringes, but which now was becoming part of the political mainstream, so that you could have presidential candidates vowing, as Herman Cain did, and as Newt Gingrich himself did, vowing that they would never allow a Muslim to serve in their cabinet. When Newt Gingrich was asked about that, he said, well, during World War II, we didn't let any Nazis serve in the president's cabinet. Again, did you catch that? Not during World War II, we didn't let any Germans serve in a cabinet, but during World War II, we didn't let any Nazis run in the cabinet, which is why during the War on Terror, we would never allow any Muslims to serve in a cabinet. Do you get the logic there? Do you see what's happening? This kind of talk was totally new. Nobody would say something like that even 2 years before. And yet, it was becoming so much a part of the political mainstream that it was actually becoming fodder for presidential debates. Now, of course, this isn't just rhetoric. There is a consequence to these kinds of words, to this kind of echo chamber. And the consequences are fairly clear. You have this, by the way, it's a very, very famous quotation by this man who burned down a mosque. And when he was asked by the judge asked him, quote, "Do you know any Muslims?" And Mr. Lin replied, "No, I only know what I hear on Fox News." Part of the court records, by the way. Of course, you had situations in which even non-Muslims were being targeted and murdered because of the fact that they even looked like Muslims. You had these sort of enormous violent events against foreigners, against anyone that sort of had the resemblance to a Muslim. And of course, in one of the worst cases of anti-Muslim violence in recent years, you had the case of Anders Behring Breivik, the far-right Norwegian militant nationalist who ended up killing some 76 people, 70 of them children, and who did so quite clearly espousing the same rhetoric that we saw from these misinformation experts. Now, what I want to emphasize is once again that this kind of anti-Muslim sentiment, this sort of unprecedented surge of anti-Muslim violence, has very little to do with the reality on the ground. The rhetoric itself, as I said, is absolutely unrepresentative of the reality of the Muslim American community in the United States. The facts speak for themselves. There are about 3 million or so Muslims in the United States, so that's about 1% of the population. 1% of the population. So we're a little bit a ways from the complete takeover of this country that we have planned for you all. Let us get to 2%, and then the White House is ours. Okay? 1% of this country is Muslim. The demographics are remarkable. 63% of Muslims in the United States are first-generation immigrants. And of course, of those immigrants, they have the highest citizenship rates of any other immigrant community in the United States. So this sort of constant rhetoric that one hears about the American Muslim community, it's not like other immigrant communities. They don't assimilate. They don't accommodate to American values. That obviously is not true. Highest rates of citizenship in the United States. By the way, even their political views are among the most mainstream. In fact, this is probably the most obvious fodder for the Islamophobes, that there is something wrong with Muslims if more than half of them think that things are going just fine in America. Maybe they are just a little bit crazy. By the way, not just the highest rates of satisfaction, the highest rates of citizenship, the highest literacy rates of any immigrant community, the highest education rates of any immigrant community in the United States, and indeed the highest income rates. As a matter of fact, the combined annual disposable income of the American Muslim community, Muslim/Middle Eastern community in the United States, according to this advertising giant JWT, is $170 billion. That the median household income for a Muslim household in the United States is higher than it is for a non-Muslim household. So the reality of the American Muslim community is an integrated, educated, literate, deeply politically satisfied, engaged, and wealthy, and I have to bring up the wealthy part because we do actually live in a country in which the Supreme Court told us quite literally that your money is your voice, so that matters a little bit. But that sense of the reality of the Muslim American community becomes almost the exact opposite of what you hear from these misinformation experts. And this is especially true when it comes to things like views on violence. Perhaps the most often heard rhetoric from these sort of fear-mongering groups is the notion that Islam and Muslims have a different view about violence, that they're more violent than other religious communities. Well, the folks at Gallup put this to a test. They asked 10 questions of American religious communities about the role of violence in society, and in every single question, all 10 of the questions, Muslim communities who answered were far less accepting of the use of violence in almost every single situation than every other religious community that was polled, including atheist communities. This is one of those questions. You can go online and look at the entire poll. This is one of those questions about the use of violence to justify killing civilians. As you can see, 78% of Muslims say that American Muslims say that it's never justified, as opposed to 58% of Protestants and Catholics, 52%, or 43% of Jews, etc. And of course, to the notion that we are all living under a different state of affairs now, a state of affairs where we are under constant attack by this terrorist sleeper cell that could get us at any moment, well, the figures speak for themselves about that too. This is true. You should actually be more scared of your lazy boy than of being killed by a terrorist. So, this is the reality that conflicts with the rhetoric. And you would think that that would actually make sense. Let me go back, I'm sorry. You would think that that would actually affect the rhetoric itself, but it doesn't. And this is the most important thing to understand about what we are talking about today. We who live in sort of these educational environments, we who grow up in a particular socio-economic environment, we have this tendency to think that bigotry is the result of ignorance. You hear it all the time. You probably hear it from your teachers, that the best way to combat bigotry is through knowledge. It's a great idea. And by no means am I sitting here denigrating education. I am a professional educator. I'm contractually obligated to actually talk about how great education is. They'll take away my tenure if I don't. But let's be honest for a moment. Data does not change people's minds. I know we'd like to think that bigotry is just a result of ignorance, and if you just had the proper information, then you wouldn't be such a bigot anymore. Except that there are some really, really smart bigots out in the world. Very well-educated, well-informed bigots. It turns out that knowledge and education is not enough, which is kind of a depressing thing to say, particularly because so much of the effort by American Muslim communities to combat this kind of negative stereotype involves teaching people about Islam. If only people knew more about Islam, if only they could be more educated about Islam, then they wouldn't fear us or hate us as much. Have you ever met an American? That's not how we think. That's not how we work. It turns out that the reason that data doesn't change people's minds, that information, no matter how many graphs you show, no matter how many statistics you show, doesn't change people's minds, is for the very simple reason that bigotry doesn't reside up here. Bigotry resides in here. And this is impervious to data. You could flood this all day long with statistics and information, and it won't make a difference, because this is about fear. It's about anxiety. It's about an identity crisis that exists, among ourselves. Information is not enough. Which is why I always sort of emphasize that when we talk about this sort of anti-Muslim bigotry issue, we have to remember that it's not a Muslim problem, it's an American problem. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that it's not even really about Muslims. Let me go back to what I said about what is miraculous about the American identity. And this notion that we are a country that defines itself not by a common ethnicity or a common culture or a common language or a common religion, but adherence to a set of common principles, a set of common values. Well, the problem, as I said, was that in times of societal stress, it becomes very difficult for us to have the sense of agreement that we once had about what those values are, about what it means to be American. And certainly, we can argue that we are in the midst of one of these times of societal stress. An economy that has collapsed. For many Americans, they've woken up to a country that they don't really recognize anymore. The racial landscape has changed, the political landscape, the religious landscape has certainly changed. Even our very role in the world has changed. You can't seriously talk about the United States as the world's sole superpower any longer the way we used to in the 90s and the early 2000s. That kind of conversation would get you laughed out of a room nowadays. And for a lot of Americans, that sense of a changing, unrecognizable country has created an identity crisis. And the problem is that in those times when it's become very difficult to sort of define who you are, the easiest way to come up with that answer, who am I, who are we, the easiest way to do so is to define yourself in opposition to somebody else. And so for a lot of these Americans, a lot of the same people whose polls that I just showed you, for a lot of them, this sort of sense of anti-Muslim fear, this sort of Islamophobia that has gripped this country, has very little to do with Islam, very little to do with Muslims. The vast majority of them will readily admit that they've never even met a Muslim. It has everything to do with themselves and with this sort of lack of concrete notion of what it means to be American. Indeed, I would say that for many of these individuals, what it means to be an American means not being a Muslim. That's what it means. Now, this is an old story in the United States. And as we're looking back at the next 100 years, I think it would be a good idea to sort of stop for a moment and look back at the previous 100 years and see what examples we could learn from that. You see, everything that has been said about America's Muslim community, that they're un-American, that their values conflict with us, that they don't belong here, they don't act like us, they don't pray like us, they don't fast like us, they don't worship like us, they are not us, they are an internal enemy, they are the opposite of us. Everything that's been said about American Muslims over the last decade or so was said about Catholics in this country in the end of the 19th century. Indeed, in the 1890s, anti-Catholic hysteria was so pronounced in this country, so much a part of the political mainstream in this country, that we actually passed laws, federal laws, trying to curb the number of Catholics who could enter this country, Catholic immigrants who could enter this country. It was perfectly standard political rhetoric to say that you could not be both Catholic and American because you can't serve both the Pope and the President. You can't be loyal to America and Rome. That Catholic values and American values are absolutely at odds with each other. That indeed, Catholicism itself was profoundly anti-democratic and so had no place in the United States. This was standard, common, mainstream rhetoric about Catholics in the 1890s. Of course, today, Catholics are as much a part of the cultural and religious fabric of this country as anybody else. The same exact phrase, the same exact words were being used about Jews in the interwar period, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. Anti-Jewish hysteria in this country was at levels that would make even the anti-Muslim sentiment in this country look like nothing. You had politicians, business leaders like Henry Ford. Henry Ford, who is sort of seen in this country as sort of this paragon of American ingenuity, who was also a despicable anti-Semite. Henry Ford, who published the protocols of the Elders of Zion in his newspapers as though it were news, and forced his dealerships around the country to sell these papers. You had popular preachers like Father Charles Coughlin. Charles Coughlin was, the 1920s version of Billy Graham, except unlike Billy Graham, also a despicable anti-Semite. Charles Coughlin would go around doing these tent revivals around the country, talking about the Jews as Christ killers. Indeed, not long after he began his ministry, his organization was raided by the FBI when it was discovered that they were actually stockpiling weapons, preparing for the final war against the Jews. This was not the fringe in the 1920s and 30s. This was the mainstream. This wasn't some, unknown preacher in some, God-forsaken part of the country. This was the most popular preacher in the United States at the time. And again, today, Jews are as much a part of the cultural and religious fabric of this country as anybody else. So much so that the same people who, 80, 90 years ago would have probably been standing right next to Charles Coughlin talking about the Jews as Christ killers, nowadays often talk about the Judeo-Christian values upon which this country was built. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, Judeo-Christian means Protestant. This is not a new phenomenon. We've heard this in other times of societal stress in this country. We have heard this rhetoric before. We've seen this entire process of opposing, of defining ourselves in opposition to an in-group happen over and over again. And there's no reason to think that the same thing won't happen today. That the same rhetoric that we hear about America's Muslim community is going to transform into Muslims becoming as much a part of the religious and cultural fabric of this country as any other religious community. That's guaranteed. We know that that's going to happen. The question is, how? And this goes back to what I said about education and knowledge. Education is important. Knowledge is important. All of that is true. But it's not enough. It's not enough to actually change people's minds. It's not enough to change this. What changes this? Not information, but relationships. And indeed, the polls prove this out too. The same Gallup organization that did most of the polling that I showed you about anti-Muslim sentiment in this country also discovered that nearly 2/3 of Americans claim to have never met a Muslim in their entire lives, which I find hard to believe, probably because they think we're all wearing turbans or something. But what they discovered when they began to crunch the numbers is that the greatest determinant to your negative views about Islam are whether you know a Muslim or not. If you know one Muslim, and I don't mean like your best friend is a Muslim, it's like the bus driver is a Muslim or the guy at the store is a Muslim. If you know one Muslim, it cut in half the negativity rating that you had about Islam. And that's obvious why. Because if you know an actual human being, then you can't sort of label them so easily as just simply an other. You can't just think of them as the opposite of you. You have to recognize that they have the same dreams, the same aspirations, the same hopes, the same struggles, the same conflicts as you yourself do. You have no choice but to see them as a human being. And this becomes incredibly important in transforming the way that we think. Demographers tell us that this country is about 10 years away, if not less, from being the first country in the world to become majority minorities. That is an astounding statement. If you want to know how crazy that statement is, take a second and try to think of what the second country will be. What we have done in this country is a miracle. The fact that we have managed to figure out a way to take the most diverse nation in the world and transform it into this sense of unity is mind-blowing. But that sense of unity has to be redefined with each generation. And it begins with a recognition that it's relationships, that the relationships that we all build with each other, between religions, between races, between cultures, between ethnicities, even between nationalities, that it's the relationships that we build amongst each other that actually moves this country forward, that creates precisely the path necessary for these out-groups to become in-groups again. So, I'm just going to leave you with this thought as you think about the next 100 years. The responsibility for what this country is going to look like in the next 100 years, what this country is going to feel like, rests on the shoulders of everybody in this room. It rests on you to make sure that you define the other, not based on the sort of simple identities that you can ascribe to them, but based on your human interaction, your human relationship to them. And it depends on a simple question, which is, what kind of country do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a country that was founded upon the sort of very principles of unity, the principles of liberty, justice, freedom for all, the promise that this country has been built on? A country in which all people, regardless of their background or their immigrational status, all people are considered united by this common cause, this common identity of America? Or do you want to live in a country in which we are constantly picking out one group of us in order to figure out who we ourselves are? This becomes the challenge for the next 100 years. And it's a challenge that the more I sort of talk to young people, the more high schools that I visit, the more I look at people like you, it's a challenge that I am absolutely convinced that we are ready to tackle. Thank you. It's good to see you.
On behalf of Han community, thank you very much for coming to Han School.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. We're kind of short on time, but I can sort of get to maybe 2 questions, and then I will try my hardest to answer them quickly, which is what everyone always says before they go on and on for like 10 minutes per question. But I'll try my best to answer them questions. So if you would just mind raising your hand and then wait till I pick you, and then stand up and then just sort of shout your question as loud as you can, and I'll repeat it. Yes, sir. Right. Very good question. The question, of course, is about the ongoing conflict, civil war in Syria, which is now spread across the region to Lebanon, to Iraq, even to Turkey. And the fact that a fairly sizable force of this sort of organizations, actually, to be honest, they're on both sides, fighting for and against the Assad regime, are being funded, they're terrorist organizations, jihadist organizations that are being funded by, for instance, Saudi Arabia, one of our closest allies. And how do we explain this to Americans? This is a really, really astute question, because what it really brings into play is the geopolitical nature of some of these fears that we have. I mean, it may seem kind of weird that our greatest enemy in the region is Iran, and our greatest friend in the region is Saudi Arabia, when 15 of the 18 hijackers were Saudi, when the vast majority of the funding, in fact, by some estimates to the tune of nearly $75 billion over the last 20 years, has been pouring out of Saudi Arabia to fund these kind of very puritanical, sometimes not often violent, interpretations of Islam and Muslim organizations, many of which have damaged American interests, that have killed American lives. But we, unfortunately, get a good part of our oil from Saudi Arabia, And so those geopolitical concerns keep us from actually punishing Saudi Arabia for its behavior, or, heaven forbid, actually even criticizing it in public for its behavior. This is something that you're all old enough to understand, which is that the United States, like every country in the world, makes its decisions based less on sort of values and ideals and principles and more on what is in our best interest as a nation, economically speaking, with regards to national security. This is how nations work. I do a lot of work in international relations and in global affairs, and the one thing that I always have to remind people about is that international affairs is about preserving interests. It's not about solving problems. The United States doesn't look at a problem like Syria and say, how do we fix that? What we say is, how do we maintain our interests in Syria? What do we need to do to maintain our economic, our national security interests? Now again, that's not, it may seem like a bad thing, but it's not. It's just normal. That's just how it is. Every decision that we make is based on what is in the best interest or the perceived best interests of the United States, whether it's supporting dictators in the region or whether it's maintaining unfair trade practices in Latin America so I can have a $1.99 coffee instead of a $5.99 coffee. That is the reality that we're dealing with. And so it becomes very important to your question about the how, it becomes very important to sort of be able to have the knowledge, the awareness necessary to read through the simple headlines that you hear. When you hear something like, jihadists fighting in Syria, go beyond those headlines. Figure out where those jihadists are, who's funding them, who's supporting them, and things become much less clear. They become much more murky as a result. But that's what I mean when I say that education is important. It's important, that information is important because it gives you a greater awareness of what's going on in the world and a greater ability to interpret things. But it's not enough to change people's minds, I don't think. That requires something deeper. That requires relationships. Time for one more. And is there another student? No, then we'll just, yes, ma'am.
A question about your book, Zealot. You had said that there were messiahs, miracle workers, healers, etc., that came before Jesus. Why do you think, after all your research, that the religion was founded on Jesus and not any of the ones prior to him?
Very good question. So this question is specifically about my latest book, Zealot, which is a biography of the historical Jesus. One thing that I say in the book that I think comes as a surprise to a lot of people is that during the century or so, around which Jesus lived, this first century, there were many, many messiahs, many people who walked the Holy Land, healing the sick, talking about the kingdom of God, performing miracles, calling themselves Messiah, gathering disciples to them. And in fact, many of them were, in their lifetime, far more successful than Jesus was, had far, far more followers than Jesus did during their lifetime. And the question is a very good one, which is, how come we forgot about all those other ones and only one of them is still called Messiah? It's a very complex question that I try to answer in the book, but if I were to put it in its simplest sort of 2-minute version, I would just say this, that it had to do with primarily two things. One, from as far as we know, Jesus' movement carried with it not just the sort of traditional notion of the Messiah as liberator, as somebody that would liberate the Jews from the yoke of oppression, the yoke of occupation, but it also carried this profound and revolutionary social teachings, this notion of the kingdom of God being a real thing that would require the reversal of the social order. When you look at Jesus' teachings, it's all about the rich and the poor switching places, the hungry and the fed switching places. Blessed are the hungry, for they shall be fed. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall rejoice. And then Jesus kept going. Woe to those who are fed, for they shall go hungry. Woe to those who rejoice, for they shall mourn. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. No one had ever said anything like this before. This isn't a sort of a message of, let's all hold hands and sing kumbaya. This isn't a message of equality. This is a frightening new reality that Jesus is talking about, in which those at the bottom and those at the top are going to switch places. And as you can imagine, this was a pretty appealing message if you're on the bottom. It's a pretty threatening message if you're on the top. In fact, it's enough to get you killed. But that message survived. It survives Jesus' execution. It became part of the social message, the social gospel that Jesus preached, and it really allowed for this movement to continue in a very interesting way. But then the second thing, which I think is perhaps even more important, has less to do with anything Jesus himself said or did, though what he said or did was extraordinary, than with what the disciples said and did, and particularly said about him after he died. And this has to go through very complex issues about what it even means for a Jew to say, I am the Messiah. For a Jew in the first century to stand up and say, I am the Messiah, means something very, very specific. It means that you are the descendant of King David, that you are here to reestablish David's kingdom on earth. That's what it means. Everybody who said, I am the Messiah, meant that. Now, if you say you are the Messiah and you die without doing the principal task of the Messiah, creating the kingdom of David, you're not the Messiah. And indeed, all the other Messiahs who claimed to be the Messiah and then who died, their disciples just sort of went home. That was kind of the end of that. I mean, obviously, you didn't do what the Messiah was supposed to do, so you're not the Messiah. The problem is that Jesus also didn't do what the Messiah was supposed to do. And when confronted with that, and in this sort of shadow of this miraculous, ecstatic experience that the disciples had of Jesus risen from the dead, and you can interpret that however you want to interpret that. The fact is that the resurrection is sort of beyond, a historian's purview, though the claim to the resurrection, the fact that his disciples said that he rose again, that's a historical fact. And again, how you interpret that is a matter of faith, not a matter of history. But buoyed by this experience and confronted with the fact that Jesus, as the Messiah, didn't do what the Messiah was supposed to do, they changed the definition of Messiah. They went back to the Hebrew Bible and they began to sort of re-examine what the very idea of Messiah meant. And they transformed the Messiah from an earthly figure to a heavenly figure, somebody that could be much more appealing, particularly to a non-Jewish audience. And indeed, that's precisely what happened. Very, very soon, within a decade after Jesus' death, this was no longer a Jewish movement. It was now a movement that was primarily being promulgated among non-Jews. And the more non-Jews accepted this movement, the more the movement itself started to change a little bit and slowly become what we now recognize as Christianity. So why do we remember Jesus? Why is Jesus still called the Messiah and the rest of them not? It's because partly of what Jesus said and how that sort of survived him, but mostly because of what was said about Jesus after his death. It's a very good question. Thank you. All right, thanks, everyone.
Okay. Shall I?